The wind rolled across the open plains, carrying the dry scent of dust and sagebrush, whispering through the endless expanse of grassland that stretched as far as the eye could see. The big sky above Montana burned a pale gold beneath the fading sun, casting long shadows over the distant hills. For Jack Callahan, this land wasn't just home. It was a promise, a legacy carved from sweat, grit, and blood. But lately, the promise felt heavier than ever. The Callahan Ranch, 300 acres of stubborn earth and wild cattle, stood on the brink of collapse. A year of harsh winters, drought, and relentless cattle thieves had left Jack fighting to hold on. He was a man used to solitude, a man who carried the weight of survival in his broad shoulders and calloused hands. But even he knew he couldn't fight forever, not alone. That was why he'd sent for her, a mail-order bride. It wasn't romance that drove him to it, not at first. It was necessity. A ranch like his needed a woman's hand, someone to keep order in the house, manage the kitchen, help with the books. But over time, the letters had changed everything. Her name was Emma Thorne, and in every envelope she seemed to breathe life back into him. Jack had memorized her words. He knew the way she dreamed of the West, of open skies and clean air, of a life built with honesty, hard work, and faith. Somewhere between the lines he'd begun to imagine a future, their future, and today she would finally arrive. The arrival Jack leaned against the hitching post outside the small Pine Ridge station, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his dark hat tipped low against the sun. Around him, the dusty little town buzzed with life. Ranch hands unloading supplies, children darting between horses, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing from somewhere down the road. In the distance, the stagecoach rumbled into view, its wheels grinding against dry earth. Jack's heartbeat quickened. He imagined what she'd look like in person. Emma Thorne, the woman who'd written him poetry in her last letter, who promised him warmth and companionship in a land that could freeze a man's soul. The coach slowed, its horses snorting clouds of dust. The driver called out, "Pine Ridge Station," before climbing down to unload the trunks. Passengers began stepping off the coach one by one, merchants, a traveling preacher, a weary mother holding her child. Then came her. Jack's breath caught as the next young woman descended the steps. She was smaller than he'd expected, barely 20, with soft chestnut hair spilling loose beneath a plain bonnet. Her gray traveling dress was dusted from the road, and her pale hands clutched a worn carpet bag. But it wasn't her size or dress that stopped him cold. It was her eyes. They were the wrong color. "You're not Emma," Jack said finally, his voice low, roughened by the wind and something darker. Confusion. The girl hesitated, twisting her fingers around the handle of her bag before answering. "No," she whispered. "I'm Clara. Emma's my sister." The confession. Inside the small, dim-lit station house, the air smelled of tobacco and leather. Jack leaned against the rough-hewn counter, his jaw tight, while Clara sat stiffly on the bench opposite him. "Start talking," he said, his voice sharp but measured. Clara's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. "Emma, she's not coming," she admitted. 2 weeks ago, she ran off. She fell in love with someone else, and I'm a doctor back in Boston. She couldn't face telling you herself. She asked me to come in her place." Jack stared at her, silent. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. "You're telling me," he said slowly. "I sent for your sister. I paid her fare. I prepared a home. And now you're standing here saying she's gone?" Clara nodded, shame pulling her shoulders inward. "I thought—" She hesitated, struggling to meet his gaze. "I thought maybe I could still make good on the promise she made. You needed someone, and I had nowhere else to go." Jack ran a hand down his face, dragging his palm across his stubble. He wanted to be angry. He should be angry. But staring at this small, trembling girl, lost, and alone on the edge of the frontier, anger didn't seem to fit. "You don't know what kind of life you're walking into," he said finally. "This land, it don't forgive mistakes. I'll work. Clara said softly, her voice steadying. I'll learn. Please, just give me a chance. Whispers in the wind by. The time they reached the ranch that evening, the sun was dipping low, staining the prairie in shades of amber and blood red. Clara stared wide-eyed at the vast expanse before her, the endless grasslands, the sharp peaks on the horizon, the weathered house sitting stubbornly against the setting sun. But what struck her most was the silence. Back east, even the quiet carried noise, carriages clattering, neighbors gossiping, city bells tolling. But here the silence was alive. The wind whispered secrets through the grass. The coyotes called from distant hills. Every creak of the wagon felt deafening against the vastness of it all. Jack helped her down and said little as he unloaded her trunk. Clara sensed his restraint. His thoughts a storm he wasn't ready to share. It wasn't until supper, as they sat opposite each other at the worn kitchen table, that he finally spoke. You can stay, he said gruffly. But I didn't send for you. You're not her. Don't expect me to forget that. Clara lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the edge of her tin cup. She didn't answer. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, a lone wolf howled, foreshadowing danger. 2 days later, while hanging laundry behind the ranch house, Clara noticed a rider on the ridge, a tall man on a black horse sitting motionless against the blazing horizon. He didn't come closer, just watched. When Jack returned from the north pasture, she told him. Silas Kane, Jack muttered, his expression hardening. Neighbor and rancher. Always had his nose where it don't belong. He didn't say more, but Clara saw the way his jaw tightened, the shadows that deepened in his gaze. She didn't know then how deeply Silas Kane's name would tangle itself into their lives, how soon blood, secrets, and betrayal would find them. The days that followed Clara Thorne's arrival at the Callahan ranch carried a peculiar heaviness. Morning sun rose golden over the plains, cattle stirred in the pastures, and wind rippled endlessly through the grass. Yet inside the small ranch house the air seemed colder. Jack spoke little at breakfast, answering questions with single words, his eyes always drifting to the horizon, as though waiting for something, or perhaps someone, who wasn't there. Clara felt the silence pressing on her like a burden. She had traded crowded streets and endless chatter of Boston for a land where even the quiet had teeth. Each time Jack's gaze slid past her without warmth, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake stepping off that wagon. But mistakes or not, she could not go back. There was no train home, no family waiting, no choice but to make her place, here. And so she worked. From sunrise to sunset, Clara threw herself into chores she had never known before. She learned to milk cows with trembling hands, to scrub floors blackened with years of dust, to haul water from the well until her arms ached, her palms blistered, her back stiffened. Yet she forced herself onward, determined that Jack would see she was more than a poor substitute for her sister. Sometimes in the dim glow of lantern light, she thought she saw the faintest softening in his eyes, quickly buried again behind that hard exterior. Gossip in town. The first time Clara went into Pine Ridge since her arrival, she felt the town's eyes on her like prying fingers. The general store buzzed with whispers when she stepped through the door, her plain bonnet tilted low in an effort to shield her face. That's her, someone muttered near the flour sacks. Not the one he sent for, another voice said, low but sharp. Clara's cheeks burned as she kept her focus on the shelves, clutching a tin of coffee tighter than necessary. She had grown up in a city where gossip rolled like smoke, but this was different. Crueler somehow, magnified by the isolation of frontier life where news spread like wildfire and lingered long after the spark. Behind the counter, old Mr. Dawson, the storekeeper, gave her a polite enough smile, but his eyes lingered, curious and judgmental. Mrs. Callahan, is it? He asked. Clara hesitated, the word sticking in her throat. Jack hadn't called her that. He hadn't called her much, of anything at all. Yes, she said finally, the lie tasting strange on her tongue. When she left with her parcels, she heard laughter behind her, though she couldn't be sure if it was meant for her or not. Still, it clung to her shoulders like thorns all the way back to the ranch. A fragile friendship, it was a week later, while Clara hung laundry on the line, that she noticed someone approaching from the edge of the pasture. A woman, tall, dark-haired, with braids trailing over her shoulders. Her buckskin dress was weathered, and beads shimmered faintly in the sun. She walked with quiet dignity, her gaze steady. "You're the new wife," the woman said simply when she reached the yard. Her accent carried the rhythm of the Lakota tongue. Yes. I'm Clara." "Nahima," the woman replied, nodding. "I trade herbs with Jack sometimes." Clara felt a sudden warmth at the sound of her voice, a small tether in this land of strangers. Nahima pointed to the laundry, her lips curling slightly. "You hang them too close. The wind will not dry them. Spread wider." Clara blushed. "I didn't know. Thank you." Over the days that followed, Nahima visited again, bringing bundles of herbs, stories of the land, and quiet companionship. She taught Clara to identify healing plants along the creek, to braid rope from prairie grass, to listen to the wind as though it carried warnings. But in her dark eyes lay something more, a guarded sadness, and when Clara asked about it, Nahima only said, "The settlers bring trouble. More every season. There are whispers of blood to come." The shadow of Silas Kane one evening, as Jack mended a fence and Clara carried supper to him. A horseman appeared over the ridge. Clara's heart clenched when she recognized him, the same figure she'd seen watching from afar before. "Silas Kane," Jack muttered, straightening as the rider approached. Silas dismounted with a grin that did not reach his eyes. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with hair the color of rust and a mustache that curled at the ends. His coat was finer than most ranchers could afford, and his boots gleamed. "Callahan," Silas drawled, tipping his hat. His gaze slid to Clara, lingering too long. "And this must be the bride. Though, not the one we expected, eh?" Clara stiffened, clutching the basket tighter. Jack's jaw hardened. "She's none of your concern." Silas chuckled, his smile sharp as a knife. "Everything in these parts is my concern, Jack. Land, cattle, even wives." Before Clara could speak, Jack stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Get off my property." Silas held his hands up in mock surrender, but his eyes gleamed with malice. "Easy, neighbor. Just offering my welcome. But if you ever find you've taken on more than you can handle..." His gaze slid back to Clara. "You know where to find me." He swung into his saddle and rode off, leaving dust and unease in his wake. That night, Jack barely touched his supper. Clara saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he stared into the fire long after the flames had burned low. Growing tension, despite the unease. Something fragile began to shift between Clara and Jack. She found herself stealing glances at him when he worked shirtless in the fields, muscles taut beneath the sun. She caught the rare moments when his laughter, low, rough, and fleeting, slipped free while breaking horses or mending tack. Yet every tender moment was followed by distance. Jack carried guilt like a stone in his chest, guilt that Clara wasn't the woman he had chosen. And Clara herself carried the secret letter from Emma, hidden in her trunk, the words haunting her each night. "Don't trust Jack Callahan." Still, when their hands brushed while passing plates, or when Jack lingered too long at the doorway watching, her so-by-lantern light sparks flared. Neither of them dared name it, but it was there, undeniable, growing. A violent night. The storm came sudden. Clouds gathered like an army, thunder rolling across the plains. Rain hammered the roof as Jack and Clara sat in the kitchen, the lantern swinging with each gust. Then, gunshots. Jack leapt to his feet, grabbing the rifle by the door. "Stay here," he ordered, though Clara followed to the window, heart pounding. Through sheets of rain, she saw figures, shadows moving among the cattle pens. A shot rang out, and one of Jack's ranch hands cried out before collapsing in the mud. Jack fired back, his voice raw with fury. The attackers fled into the storm, their shapes vanishing like ghosts. When silence finally returned, Clara stepped into the yard, the rain soaking her dress, and saw the lifeless body of the ranch hand at her feet. Her stomach twisted. This was not Boston. This was not the life she had known. Here, blood spilled into the dirt and men died without warning. Jack knelt beside the body, his face carved from stone. When he rose, his eyes met Clara's, and in them she saw a promise, of vengeance, of justice, of a storm yet to come. The days after the raid passed under a heavy, unnatural silence. The Callahan ranch bore fresh scars, shattered fence, posts, blood-darkened earth near the cattle pens, and the lingering memory of the man who died in the mud. Jack buried him on the northern ridge without ceremony, his jaw tight, his words few. Clara watched him from the kitchen window as he worked late into the night, mending fences by lantern light, the silhouette of his broad shoulders outlined against the pale glow. She wanted to go to him to offer comfort, but something in his expression, the flinty coldness in his eyes, warned her to keep her distance. And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, she heard him pacing the wooden floors of the house, restless as a caged wolf. Jack Callahan was a man carrying too many battles inside him, against the land, against thieves, against the memory of a woman he'd never met, and the sister he hadn't chosen. And though Clara longed to believe they could find peace here, some deeper instinct whispered that the storm had only begun. Whispers in Pine Ridge. 3 days after the raid, Jack saddled his horse and rode into Pine Ridge to speak with the sheriff. Clara went along, needing supplies, though part of her wished to avoid the stares she'd endured before. The town was buzzing with rumor when they arrived. Outside the saloon, men clustered in tight groups, their voices sharp, glances darting toward Jack as he passed. Inside the sheriff's office, the air smelled of dust and pipe smoke. Sheriff Hal Crow leaned back in his chair, boots on the desk, his weathered face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Cattle thieves," he said after Jack explained the raid. "But there's something strange about it. No stolen cattle, no burned barns, just blood spilled for nothing." "You think Silas Kane's behind it?" Jack said flatly. Crow chewed on the thought before answering. "Could be, but Silas ain't stupid enough to leave tracks leading back to his door." Clara listened quietly, her hands twisting in her lap. She thought of the way Silas had stared at her the night he rode up, that mocking smile that never reached his eyes. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the sound of distant laughter from the saloon. Clara glanced toward the noise, and that's when she saw him, leaning casually against a hitching post, hat tipped low, a pistol glinting at his hip. The outlaw, a dangerous encounter. Later that afternoon, as Clara loaded supplies onto the wagon, behind the general store the man approached. "Miss Thorne," he said smoothly, his voice low, touched with something dangerously charming. She turned, startled. "How do you know my name?" "Word travels fast in towns like these," he said, lifting his hat just enough to reveal sharp green eyes and a boyish grin. "Name's Cole Mercer." The name carried a whisper of trouble. Clara had heard it murmured by passing ranch hands. A gunslinger, a gambler, an outlaw who never stayed in one place long enough to be caught. "You were watching me," Clara said carefully. "Watching ain't a crime," Cole replied with a lazy shrug. "But you? You're something of a curiosity in Pine Ridge, a rancher's bride who ain't the bride he ordered." Clara stiffened, embarrassed heat rising to her cheeks. "Whatever you've heard, it's none of your concern." "Maybe," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "But maybe it is. See, I knew your sister." Clara froze. "Emma?" Cole nodded slowly. "We crossed paths down in Denver 3 weeks back. She was looking for someone to help her disappear. The outlaw's promise." They moved to a quieter alley, away from prying eyes. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched her basket. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. Cole's grin faded, his expression darkening. "Emma didn't run off with a doctor like you were told. She ran because someone's got something on her, something dangerous. She told me to find you, to warn you." Clara's breath caught. "Warn me of what?" Cole leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Silas Kane." Her stomach twisted at the name. "Emma said he ain't the man he pretends to be," Cole continued. "He's got a hand in half the trouble this territory's seen. Cattle raids, land disputes, even bounties on his own neighbors. And if he's got his sights on you now. Cole trailed off, letting the implication hang heavy in the dusty air. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked finally. Because I gave your sister my word, Cole said simply. She saved my life once. Figured I owed her something. Before she could reply, footsteps approached, and Jack's voice cut sharply through the air. Step away from her. Collision of tempers. Jack stood at the mouth of the alley, rifle slung casually over one shoulder, though there was nothing casual in his stance. His jaw was tight, his gaze cold, fixed on Cole Mercer. Callahan, Cole said, tipping his hat. Always a pleasure. Can't say the same, Jack muttered. What business do you have with my wife? Clara opened her mouth to explain, but Cole beat her to it. Just passing along a message from her sister, he said lightly, though his eyes never left Jack's. Funny thing, though. Seems your neighbor Silas ain't as respectable as he'd like folks to think. Jack stepped forward close enough that tension sparked in the narrow space between them. You stay away from her, Mercer, I mean it. Cole smiled faintly, tilting his hat lower. Suit yourself. But if you want to keep her safe, you'll listen to what she's got to say. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jack and Clara in heavy silence. Seeds of doubt. On the ride back to the ranch, Clara told Jack everything Cole had said. His hands tightened on the reins, his expression unreadable. You believe him? Jack asked finally. I don't know, Clara admitted. But why would he lie? Jack didn't answer right away. The rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels filled the silence between them. Finally, he said, Men like Cole Mercer don't do favors for free, there's always a price. Clara stared out at the rolling plains, the horizon blurring in the distance. And Silas? She asked softly. Do you think he's capable of all that? Jack hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. Trouble brewing. Over the next week, strange things began happening around the ranch. Tools went missing. Fence posts were cut clean through in the night. A barn door was left open, and 3 cattle wandered off into the hills. Jack grew darker, more withdrawn, patrolling the property with his rifle slung low, his temper fraying like worn rope. Nahima came one evening with news from her tribe. The settlers push deeper every season, she said gravely. Some talk of retaliation. There is anger on all sides. If blood spills, the land will drink deep. Clara felt the tension tightening around her like a noose. Silas's lurking shadow, Cole Mercer's warning, the unsettled truce between native tribes and ranchers, and above it all, Jack's growing fury. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The twist, Emma's fate. One night, unable to sleep, Clara lit the lantern and unfolded Emma's warning letter for the 100th time. She traced the shaky handwriting, reading the words until they blurred. Then, a thought struck her. Cole Mercer had said he last saw Emma in Denver 3 weeks ago. But this letter had been sent only 2 weeks ago. Clara's breath hitched. If Cole had seen Emma alive, and Emma had written this letter after that meeting, then where was she now? She went to Jack's study, clutching the lantern. Jack, she whispered urgently, waking him. Emma's alive and she's in danger. Before Jack could answer, a sharp crack echoed across the night. A rifle shot from the ridge. Jack grabbed his weapon and pulled Clara behind him. Outside, the coyotes howled, and distant hooves thundered in retreat. The Callahan ranch had survived. Blizzards, cattle thieves, and gunfire, but nothing prepared them for this. A drought so relentless it felt like a punishment. The earth cracked beneath their boots, once green pastures withering into brittle yellow husks. Dust devils spun like restless spirits across the plains, and each breath carried the metallic tang of dry heat. Clara woke every morning to the hollow groan of the wind rattling the ranch house shutters, and went to bed beneath skies streaked with smoke from distant wildfires. The creeks had thinned to muddy trickles. Cattle bleated in thirst. Even the songbirds had grown silent, as though nature itself held its breath. Jack worked from dawn until darkness, hauling water barrels from a spring 5 miles north, His shoulders burned and blistered beneath the merciless sun, the skin beneath his hatline browned and cracked, and yet he pushed himself harder each day, his body wearing down as the ranch teetered on the edge of ruin. Clara watched him from the porch one evening, sweat dripping from his temples, jaw set, like iron, and for the first time she wondered if this land, this wild, unforgiving country, was slowly killing him. Rumors of War Nahima arrived one night, her dark braids damp with sweat, her usually steady gaze shadowed with fear. "Settlers, fight among themselves," she said quietly, standing in the doorway. "Water is scarce. Some ranchers take from others. My people." Her voice faltered, and she glanced toward the horizon, where the plains burned orange beneath the dying sun. "They are blamed." Clara guided her inside, offering a cup of what little water they had left. Nahima sipped once carefully before setting the tin aside. "Silas Kane spreads lies," Nahima continued. "He tells the settlers my people poisoned the creeks, drove the cattle off, cut the fences. He wants them gone, all of us gone." Clara's stomach knotted. "And the settlers believe him?" "Some," Nahima said, her tone bitter. "Others will soon enough. Blood is coming, Clara. I smell it on the wind." Silas makes his move. 2 days later, Silas Kane rode up to the ranch under a white-hot noon sun, dust swirling around his black horse's hooves. He sat tall in the saddle, his polished boots gleaming, his smile sharp as a knife. Jack stood in the yard, arms crossed, rifle slung across his back. "Come to steal water now?" Jack called, his voice rough from the heat. Silas dismounted slowly, adjusting his coat with deliberate calm. "No need to steal what you'll give up soon enough," he said smoothly. "Land like yours ain't worth dying over, Jack. You can't feed your cattle, you can't water your crops. Sell it to me while you've still got something worth selling." Jack's laugh was harsh, joyless. "You think I'd let you get your hands on my land, over my dead body?" Silas's gaze slid toward Clara, standing tense on the porch, her fingers digging into the railing. "There are easier ways for a woman like her to live," he said softly, almost kindly, though his words dripped with poison. "There's no shame in taking better offers." Before Clara could react, Jack stepped forward, closing the space between them until they stood eye to eye. "You ever set foot on my property again?" Jack growled, his voice low and deadly. "And I'll bury you where you stand." Silas studied him for a moment, then smiled. Slow, cruel, unshaken. "Careful, neighbor. Rattlesnakes bite hardest when cornered." When he rode away, Jack's knuckles were white where his fists clenched. Cole Mercer returns. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and deep gold, Clara heard hoofbeats approaching from the west. She stepped out onto the porch and froze when she saw him. Cole Mercer, reins loose in one hand, hat tilted low against the setting sun. He dismounted with his usual careless grace, boots crunching softly in the dirt. "Thought I told you to stay. Gone," Jack said coldly, appearing behind Clara. "Yeah, well," Cole replied, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Trouble's got a way of following me, Callahan. Figured it's time we stop pretending we ain't standing in the same storm." Jack folded his arms. "Speak your piece." Cole's grin faded. "Silas Kane hired bounty hunters," he said plainly. 4 of them. Dangerous men. They're coming for your land, Jack. One way or another." The words hung heavy in the dry summer air. Clara's throat tightened. "What do they want?" "The ranch," Cole said simply, "and anyone who stands in the way." Growing passion, deepening trust in the sleepless nights that followed, Clara found herself drawn closer to Jack despite the danger. He had softened toward her since the raid, subtly, in the way he lingered at the table after supper, or how his hand brushed hers as he passed her the lantern. One night, as the crickets sang faintly outside and the heat clung to the walls, Clara found him on the porch staring at the stars. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. Jack shook his head. "This land's all I've ever known. My father died fighting for it. I'll die the same way if I have to." "Clara," hesitated, then stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. "Maybe you don't have to die at all," she whispered. Jack turned to her then, his eyes shadowed, unreadable. "Maybe I already have," he said, his voice low and rough, before retreating inside. Clara stood alone beneath the wide starlit sky, her heart aching with words unspoken. The betrayal. Revealed 2 nights later, chaos erupted. Jack woke to the sound of pounding hooves and shouted voices. By the time he grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, flames were licking up the walls of the hay barn. He and his ranch hands fought the fire until dawn, sweat and soot streaking their faces. When the last embers hissed into silence, Jack found a silver clasp in the ashes, one he'd seen before. Cole Mercer's. Jack stormed into the house, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled. "Where is he?" Jack demanded. Clara stared, startled. "Cole? He's not here." Jack's voice shook with fury. "He sold us out." Clara refused to believe it, not until she saw Cole herself the next evening, a bruise blooming across his jaw and his expression grim. "Silas found out I was warning you," Cole said, spitting blood into the dirt. "He wanted me to burn the barn. I refused. His men, they made sure I'd remember it." Clara's heart twisted. Jack said nothing, but in his silence lay something sharper than anger. A growing realization that they were surrounded, trapped in a tightening noose. Emma's return. 3 days later, just as dawn broke, Clara heard a weak knock at the door. When she opened it, a figure collapsed into her arms, her breath caught in her throat. Emma. Her sister's face was pale, streaked with dirt and dried blood. Her once pristine traveling dress was torn, her bonnet missing. "Clara," Emma gasped, clutching her arm. "He's coming. Silas, he won't let me go. You have to hide me." Before Clara could answer, Jack stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the woman who had vanished months ago. And behind them, out on the distant ridge, the silhouette of a lone rider appeared against the rising sun. Dawn crept across the plains in shades of copper and rose, but the Callahan ranch lay under a heavy silence, as if even the earth itself was holding its breath. Jack sat on the porch steps, elbows braced on his knees, rifle propped against the railing beside him. His broad shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched tight beneath the morning light. Inside, Clara tended to Emma, gently dabbing a wet cloth across her sister's bruised forehead. Emma had barely stirred since collapsing the night before, her breath shallow, her face pale beneath layers of road dust and dried blood. Clara's heart ached with unspoken questions. What had happened to her? Why had she run? And why, after months of silence, had she come crawling back to the very man she'd promised to marry but abandoned without a word? The quiet was shattered when Emma's eyes fluttered open. She winced as she tried to sit, one hand instinctively clutching at her ribs. Clara steadied her, kneeling close. "Emma, what happened to you?" Clara whispered. For a long moment, Emma said nothing. Her gaze drifted toward the window where the pale sun stretched across the horizon, painting the land in fragile light. Then finally, her voice cracked. "I tried to run," she breathed. "But Silas won't let me go." Emma's confession. By evening, Emma sat wrapped in a quilt before the hearth, her trembling hands cupping a tin mug of lukewarm tea. Jack stood against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made Clara's pulse quicken. Emma swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Silas Kane? He knows. He knows what happened in Boston." Clara frowned. "What do you mean? What does Silas have to do with Boston?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Do you remember Father's debts?" Clara nodded slowly. Their father had died, leaving more losses than land, forcing them to fend for themselves in a city that swallowed girls whole if they weren't careful. "Before he died," Emma said, her voice breaking, "he borrowed money from men you wouldn't want to cross. I thought I thought marrying Jack would give us a way out. But Silas found out about the debts, Clara. He bought them. He owns us. Jack's jaw flexed, his fists curling at his sides. Emma's voice turned ragged as she continued. He threatened. He said if I didn't leave Jack and come to him instead, he'd ruin us, sell the debts to bounty hunters, put a price on our heads. So I ran. But he found me anyway. She buried her face in her hands. He'll never stop. Not until he owns everything. Lines drawn in blood. Jack paced the length of the room, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. Finally, he stopped, planting a hand on the mantel as he turned to face them. This ends now, he said, his voice low, dangerous. Jack, Clara began, but he cut her off with a sharp glance. He's been pushing this territory for years, Jack growled, buying up land, driving ranchers into debt, setting folks against each other. If we give in now, he'll take every acre from here to the river. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. But if we fight him, he'll kill us. Jack's gaze softened just slightly when it met hers. If we don't fight, Clara, we're already dead. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken fear. Nahima arrived not long after, her expression grim. My people are leaving, she said quietly. They fear what's coming. Bounty hunters move through the hills. Silas hires more men each week. Soon, there will be no law but the gun. Cole Mercer's choice. That night, as the stars burned pale and distant over the prairie, Cole Mercer rode into the yard. He looked worn, a fresh cut along his cheekbone, his shirt torn at the shoulder. Jack met him on the porch, rifle in hand. Thought I told you to stay away, Jack said flatly. And leave you to hang? Cole retorted, swinging, down from his saddle. Nah, I came to make things right. Jack's brows drew together. Why? Cole's gaze shifted to Clara, then back to Jack. Because Silas is playing me same as he's playing you. I've done bad things, Callahan, but even I've got lines I won't cross. Silas crossed them all. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of old grudges and new alliances hanging between them. Finally, Jack lowered his rifle. Fine, he said, but if you betray me again, you'll shoot me where I stand. Cole finished with a crooked grin. Yeah, I figured. Storm on the horizon. By the next morning, the air felt different, heavy, charged, as if the land itself knew violence was coming. Cole confirmed what Jack already feared. Silas had gathered men from 3 counties, bounty, hunters and hired guns hungry for blood. They weren't just coming to seize the ranch. They were coming to burn it down, to make an example of anyone who stood against him. Jack spent the day fortifying the property. Barrels of water lined the barn. Rifles were cleaned and loaded. Clara helped prepare what she could, her hands trembling only when no one was looking. She caught Cole watching her once, his expression unreadable, something almost like regret, flickering behind those sharp green eyes. Don't worry, darling, he said softly. He ain't taking this place without a fight. Emma's guilt. That night, Clara found Emma sitting alone in the loft, knees drawn to her chest, staring out the small window at the moonlit plains. I'm sorry, Emma whispered when Clara approached. This is my fault. Clara sank beside her, pulling the quilt tighter around them both. No, she said firmly. This is Silas's doing, not yours. Emma shook her head. You don't understand, Clara. I knew what kind of man he was, and I still thought I could outsmart him. I thought I could save us, but all I've done is drag you into his fire. Clara took her sister's hand, squeezing it tightly. Then we'll get out together, she said, though the conviction in her voice wavered against the roar of distant thunder. Somewhere beyond the horizon, riders gathered. The night before war. The ranch lay cloaked in silence as night fell, the moon a pale coin above the blackened hills. Jack stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching shadows shift across the distant ridges. Beside him, Cole Mercer lit a cigarette, the tip glowing like a dying ember. They'll come at dawn, Cole said quietly. Jack nodded. Then we'll be ready. Clara stepped into the doorway. the lamplight behind her spilling across the worn planks. Her gaze met Jack's, and for a heartbeat, the noise of the world seemed to fade. "Come inside," she whispered. Jack hesitated, then followed her in. Inside the quiet warmth of the ranch house, Clara reached for his hand. Jack's calloused, fingers closed around hers, rough and trembling all at once. For the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon, she felt a spark of something beyond fear. Something like hope. Fragile, but alive. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant, rumbling like drums of war. The first light of dawn bled across the Montana plains, staining the horizon in hues of gold and crimson. But there was no peace in the morning. The air hung heavy, thick with dust and tension, as if the land itself understood what was about to happen. Clara stood barefoot on the porch, the wood cold beneath her feet, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles whitened. Beyond the ranch's fences, the distant ridges crawled with shadowed figures on horseback, silhouettes slowly emerging in the rising sun. She could hear the faint rhythmic thunder of hooves, like a war drum pounding somewhere deep in her chest. Jack stepped out beside her, rifle slung across his shoulder, his dark hat low over his brow. His jaw was set hard, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Cole Mercer leaned casually against one of the porch posts, rolling a cigarette between his fingers, though his usual grin was absent. Even he felt the weight of this day. Inside the house, Emma paced nervously, wringing her hands until they were raw, while Nahima sat cross-legged on the floor, silent as stone, murmuring quiet words to spirits Clara couldn't name. This was the last calm they would know. The first shot. The riders came into view slowly, led by a man dressed in a black duster, his pale hat tipped back against the rising sun. Even at a distance, Clara recognized Silas Kane, his proud, cruel posture unmistakable. He reined in his horse just beyond rifle range and surveyed the ranch with cold amusement. Then he raised one gloved hand. The crack of a rifle shattered. The silence. Splinters exploded from the porch post beside Clara's head, forcing her backward with a startled gasp. Jack didn't flinch. He dropped to one knee, sighted down the barrel of his Winchester, and returned fire. "Inside, Clara," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. But Clara couldn't move, her legs rooted in terror as the first wave of Silas's men charged down the hill, gunfire erupting like thunderclaps across the open plains. Cole grabbed her arm, dragging her behind the water barrels as bullets whined past. "Welcome to the war, darling," he muttered grimly, drawing his revolver with a steady hand. The siege begins. The opening volley rattled the ranch house, shattering windows and tearing splinters from the wooden siding. Smoke rose from the barn as lanterns crashed to the ground. Jack barked orders over the chaos, his deep voice cutting through the roar of gunfire. "Cole, cover the west flank. Clara, stay low, and keep Emma inside." Clara scrambled back into the house, pulling Emma down behind the overturned table. Dust filled the air as bullets punched through the walls, splintering wood and shattering glass. Nahima crouched near the hearth, her bow in hand, arrows fletched with raven feathers. She glanced at Clara and nodded once. Calm, focused, unshaken. Outside, Cole returned fire with quick precision, his revolver flashing in the sunlight as he ducked behind a water trough. "There's too many of them," he shouted. Jack didn't reply, his rifle cracking again and again, each shot measured, deliberate. For every man who fell, two more seemed to take his place. Silas steps forward. The gunfire slowed as Silas Kane rode forward, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of red dust. He halted just short of the yard, removing his hat with mock courtesy, his polished boots gleaming in the sunlight. "Callahan," he called out, his voice carrying over the chaos, like a snake's hiss. "This don't have to end in blood. Sell me the ranch, hand over the girl, and I'll let you walk away." Jack stepped out from behind the trough, rifle steady in his grip. "You can burn in hell before I give you an inch of this land," he growled. Silas's smile sharpened. "Then I reckon we do this the hard way." With a flick of his hand, his men surged forward, firing wildly. Nahima's courage, the attackers, swung around the east side, trying to flank the ranch house, but Nahima was waiting. She loosed arrows with uncanny precision, each one finding its mark with silent, deadly efficiency. Clara watched in awe as Nahima moved with the grace of a hunting hawk, her braid whipping behind her as she dropped one rider after another. But then a rifle cracked and Nahima stumbled, blood blooming across her shoulder. "Nahima!" Clara cried, rushing to her side, dragging her back toward the safety of the porch. Nahima gritted her teeth, refusing to collapse, her dark eyes burning with stubborn defiance. "I will not leave you to fight alone," she rasped, knocking another arrow despite the wound. The outlaws stand Cole Mercer fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. Two of Silas's bounty hunters closed in on the west flank, revolvers raised, but Cole met them head-on, cutting one down with a clean shot and tackling the other into the dirt. The struggle was brutal, fists, elbows, teeth, until Cole finally drove his knife into the man's side, panting heavily as he rolled away. When he looked up, his eyes met Clara's across the yard. He gave her a crooked grin, blood smeared across his jaw. "Told you I'd make this right," he said before turning back into the fray, Emma's breaking point. Inside the ranch house, Emma crouched by the window, hands clamped over her ears as the chaos raged outside. Clara knelt beside her, gripping her sister's shoulders. "You have to tell me, Emma," Clara begged. "What does Silas want from you? What's he after?" Emma's breath hitched, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "He wants us ruined," she whispered. "He wants Jack dead, he wants you scared, and he wants me back. I thought I could run, Clara, but you don't outrun a man like Silas Kane." Clara's jaw tightened, fury burning through the fear. "Then we stop him. Today." The turning point. The siege stretched into hours, the sun climbing high overhead. Smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Clara's lungs burned, her ears ringing from the constant thunder of rifles. And then, suddenly, silence. Clara peered out the shattered window and saw Silas standing alone in the yard, his pistol lowered, his men retreating behind him like shadows, melting into the hills. Jack stepped forward cautiously, rifle still raised. "It's over," he warned. Silas smiled faintly, too faintly. "No, Jack," he said softly. "It's just beginning." With lightning speed, Silas drew his pistol and fired. The bullet caught Jack across the shoulder, spinning him backward. Clara screamed, running toward him, but Cole was faster. With a roar, Cole raised his revolver and fired once, twice. Silas Kane jerked violently in the saddle before collapsing into the dust, his lifeless body sprawled beneath the wide Montana sky after the storm. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara knelt beside Jack, pressing her hands to his bleeding shoulder, her tears streaking his dirt-smeared face. "I'm fine," he rasped, though his voice was strained with pain. "Just a graze." Nahima joined them, leaning heavily on her bow, her wounded arm bound hastily in cloth. Cole stood nearby, chest heaving, his pistol hanging loosely in his hand. For the first time since she'd met him, Clara saw something in Cole Mercer's face she hadn't expected: relief. "It's done," he said quietly. "It's over." But Clara knew it wasn't over. Not truly. Scars like this didn't fade. Not on the land. Not in the heart. Epilogue. Under the wide sky weeks later, the Callahan ranch stood quiet again. Fences were rebuilt. Cattle roamed the pastures. The grass, nourished by a late summer rain, returned to shades of green. Clara stood on the porch one evening watching the sun dip beneath the endless horizon. Jack joined her, his arm still bandaged but healing. "You could have left," he said softly. "After all this, you could have gone back east." Clara shook her head, sliding her hand into his. "There's nothing for me back there," she whispered. "Everything I want is here." Jack's fingers tightened around hers, rough and warm, grounding her beneath the vast open sky. Inside the ranch house, Emma hummed softly as she sewed by the fire, her face calmer than it had been in months. Nahima visited often, bringing herbs and laughter, while Cole, true to his word, rode south, leaving only a simple promise carved into the barn door. "I owed you one, debts paid," live free. As the evening light bathed the plains in gold, Clara rested her head against Jack's shoulder and breathed deeply, tasting dust, sun, and possibility on the wind. The land had nearly broken them. But somehow, beneath the endless Montana sky, they had survived. And for the first time, since stepping off that wagon, Clara knew she was home.